What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. So over the years, many people have levied criticism at the Pokémon series, and much of it is fair because nothing is beyond questioning, even the most financially successful multimedia franchise in the world. But one of the big things that we hear most is that Pokémon keeps recycling the same formula over and over and never really evolves, which is ironic given its central mechanic from the very beginning. But while the same sorts of turn-based battles do repeat, and certain setups may rhyme, such as professors offering a choice of 3 starters, I don't think that Pokémon is in quite the rut that people seem to think. Namely, I'm talking about the big picture here. There are of course smaller things that continue to show up every time, but honestly we can pretty easily separate the Pokémon timeline into 2 distinct eras. I know a lot of people will likely draw that line at the jump to 3D that happened in moving to the 3DS in Gen 6, but really to me I think a more defining line would be directly in half, with the first 4 generations on one end and Gens 5 through 8 on the other. And I'm cutting it here based around their tendencies towards predictability. If you look at Generations 1 and 2, they are probably the most tied together of any 2 to date, so they obviously share a lot of similarities. Another line that could be drawn is with the Gen 3 Chasm that forced a reboot since all of those Pokémon can now be carried up forward when the rest could not. But I still think those games are more closely related to the Game Boy era than not. And of course I would say the culmination of all the ideas they wanted to do came about with Gen 4. And I'm not the only one to say that because that's what the people making it said back in the day as well. And despite slight tweaks to the battle systems every time, Johto brings in hold items, Hoenn brings abilities, Sinnoh has the physical special split, the games on the whole are pretty much built on the same bones with nothing really out of place. The only big surprise, I guess, was Fire Red and Leaf Green, but as I just said, that was necessary because they needed to get all of those Pokémon into Gen 3 somehow. And then right after that, on schedule, Gen 4 also made remakes in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, so not quite as surprising. Not to mention the fact that each generation gave us a 3rd version that was an improved way to experience the region, each one seemingly becoming a fan favorite. But the parallels don't end there, because while each generation did have their share of unique side materials, they all contained a 3D representation of a Pokémon fighting game. Some may have had a bit more story involved, but the pattern was very clear to most anyone by this point. So that's why I make the distinction at Gen 5, because here is where they finally decided to shake things up. First and foremost, this was an obvious departure because of the whole reboot angle, where they were basically starting Pokémon from scratch, at least with the games that started the generation. And that's because, like I said, Gen 4 was designed to be a grand conclusion of what Pokémon had been up to that point, so where else could you go but start over? But aside from that in-game choice, the overall landscape of the generation was shifting as well. The Unova region did not adhere to the previously established way of doing things, and instead of the predictable Pokémon Gray starring Kyurem, we got Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, full-blown sequels to the original games. This story was years later in the same region, with some things being changed drastically, even to the point of the box art legendaries being swapped because you caught the other one last time. So that was truly unexpected for Pokémon. But at least we got the Hoenn remakes to look forward to. Oh yeah, Gen 5 didn't have any remakes. Yet another huge upheaval in the once dependable pattern of how they formatted Pokémon over the first decade of its existence. Now, there are likely a number of reasons why Hoenn never made it to the DS system, but the point is, whether they wanted to or not, they changed the way that fans look to the future. Not that there weren't complaints of the Hoenn remakes not coming on time for many fans, but Unova didn't even have a 3D battle game on the side either, back when it still would have been a novelty. So in many ways they bucked the trend so hard that we really should have caught on. Because, you see, this cavalier attitude continued on to Gen 6 as well. Now of course they offered up a pair of games to start out the generation like always, but once again, while we were all waiting for the Pokémon Z version that we were just sure was coming, they then decide to slap us with the Hoenn region remakes. Some people might say that it's still predictable to have made these games at all, but doing it years after everyone expected them means that Pokémon is pretty much just doing whatever they want. And that's made all the more apparent by the fact that we never got a follow-up from Kalos. The fan favorite trend was disrupted, some would argue, just when it was needed most. But truly, nobody expected Pokémon Go to debut at the tail end of Gen 6 as well. Maybe you don't consider a Pokémon mobile game notable enough to include in the discussion, but it was shocking how expansive this game became, still making tons of money to this day, and it's very much outside the box for the rest of the generations. But that unpredictability continued with Gen 7. Now, you might think this is not quite as out there, since it's just basically a repeat of Gen 5, with the initial games and then another pair of games to follow. However, it's not quite that simple. See, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon aren't really sequels like in Gen 5, they're closer to the third games that we've come to know from the first decade of Pokémon, except this time they're split into two versions. So even then, it's a new twist on a familiar trope. But also, let's not forget how much Alola changed internally as well, getting rid of the gyms altogether, replacing the standard Pokémon formula with the exotic new Island Trials. So even slight structural similarities to previous gens feel vastly different to anything that we've had before story-wise. But of course, Gen 7 was not done, because we also got another pair of games on a completely different system with Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. And yes, those are in fact Gen 7 games. Sure, they are remakes, but they're not Sinnoh remakes like we would have expected, and they were on the Switch, so changing consoles mid-gen had certainly never been done before with a mainline game, and they used the Go catching mechanics, altering major facets of the experience, handling wild encounters in a brand new way. And to this day, years later, the people in charge have never really even hinted at making this type of game ever again. That's just the fans. So are you seeing how the big picture keeps changing? Look no further than Gen 8. We got Sword and Shield, but then for the first time ever, instead of a third version, they created DLC to update the base game, retaining it to just the two. And then we saw the Sinnoh remakes, once again, not when we thought we would see it, and you might say that these games were far too faithful to the originals, meaning that the claim that Pokémon never changes is valid. However, the existence of the games themselves is a significant departure because they were developed by an outside company. Nobody could have seen that coming, and just imagine what that could mean in future generations. But of course, the biggest wildcard of Gen 8 was close behind with Pokémon Legends Arceus. Literally no fan could have anticipated a Sinnoh game that was so far in the distant past when the region was far wilder than we had ever seen, throwing in a bunch of different mechanics to what we were used to. So we know all of this already, but what does it actually mean? Well, when comparing the first 4 generations to the 4 most recent generations, we see a stark contrast. The pattern of the latest half of the Pokémon franchise is that there is no pattern. All we can truly expect, for sure, is that there will be 2 versions on the launch of a new generation, like with Scarlet and Violet. I doubt they'll ever really stop that, since they still like to encourage trading and that sort of thing, but we never really know if we'll be getting a follow-up game to those originals, or what kind of form that would even take. So what I'm saying is, don't be shocked if they do try DLC with Paldea, but also don't just expect it to happen because they did it one other time. You know what else happened one time? Let's Go! And we're not really likely to see a specific version quite like that again. But at the same time, those games were basically a remake of Yellow version, so we could maybe see a remake of Crystal, but I wouldn't expect it. Just like I do believe that we will someday revisit the Unova region eventually, but I doubt it will be quite like anything we've seen before. They might do yet another sequel with Black and White 3, or I'm thinking maybe at this point, it's more likely that we get a single version like Legends Arceus in some crazy style that we could never foresee. Or maybe now is when we finally see Gray version. So sure, the minutia of Pokemon games might carry over a bit from game to game, even though they do keep changing that as well, but the overall big picture of the series over time has drastically fluctuated from a standard cookie-cutter outline that you could rely on to almost anything the folks in charge feel like that day. Are we gonna keep getting 3 games per remake cycle now? Or are we just not getting one at all in Gen 9? Since Gen 8 had a big emphasis on side games, are we gonna get a break from those and take a more isolated approach like Gen 7 or 5? We just can't know these things anymore. Long gone are the days of being able to perfectly forecast every move the Pokemon Company would make. This is clearly apparent in the recent generational structure, but it even blends into the more internal mechanisms of the games. Do you really think anyone could have predicted regional variants? I mean, except for a ton of different fan-made games, or even the TCG itself beforehand? Okay, maybe that's a bad example. But how about all of the gimmicks that they keep adding? Not that I think Pokemon needs a new gimmick every generation, but you can never predict what they'll break out. After all, they got rid of HMs, and that was a big feature. And what about the open world elements? Did you truly expect for that to happen? Did you really have that much faith in Game Freak to pull it off by Generation 9? The truth of the matter is, we have no idea what to expect from Pokemon after Scarlet and Violet come out, because the last 4 generations have thrown us one curveball after another. So the next time somebody says Pokemon is too predictable, maybe just remind them that we haven't been able to accurately predict what Pokemon would do since 2010, at least on a broad scale. Again, maybe they're more talking about the kinds of journey the individual games are constructing, even though I don't think that's even fair, since they have been shedding those patterns as well. I mean, we finally got a different regional bird, only to go back to the kind that we had always known, just to move on to the first ever pure flying type that wasn't a legendary. And now we're getting 2 different Pokemon professors that aren't even named after trees. So not every aspect of what makes Pokemon familiar is so set in stone. But even so, if we're talking about the series as a whole and the generations they put out, I really don't think that reputation is quite so deserved, unless they make another 4 identical generations after this. I'm not saying to blindly praise Pokemon by any means, but at least make the critiques you use applicable to what's going on, and you might as well give them a little credit where it's due. So, what do you think about the predictability of Pokemon? Let me know down in the comments. Also, be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded.